Okay, so you got your topic. You've done some information gathering. You got a whole ton of information. You're like, Mizzo, now what? Now we organize! Woohoo! Organization. Okay, so on the day I teach structure and organization, usually what happens is people walk in, they sit down, and then I make everybody stand up and I say, okay, organize yourselves. And I very smugly sit behind my computer and I say, the only rules are you have to include everybody, and however you want to do it is fine, and just let me know when you're done. And then I sit down and everybody kind of blinks at each other and they're like, what does she mean? And then usually someone who likes to take charge says something like, let's do birthdays, let's do color of shoes we have on, let's do, and somehow they end up in some sort of organizational pattern, okay? And then we talk about that organizational pattern, and then I make them do it again. And usually I make them do it like 3 or 4 more times so that they can see there are different ways to organize themselves. So here's some points I make, right? Because I pretend that you, the people, because in this exercise you are pieces of data. And I make a big deal about you being pieces of data. And I show that, like, let's say I have a class and they all organize themselves by age. Well, depending on the data in that class, that organizational structure works better or worse. If I have a class where everybody is 19 and 20, that organizational structure isn't super interesting because they're all homogeneous. But on the classes where I have people in their 50s, plus people who are 19, and then variants along the way, that's a cool organizational structure because you can see the different pieces of data and how they vary, right? Um, I love doing it where, in one exercise, a person fits totally in because of the organizational pattern, and then they do another organizational pattern. So let's say first they do birthdays and then they do color of shirt, and the person who had like an average birthday now is wearing like a bizarre color that no one else is wearing, and so they don't really fit into any group. And it's like, you don't fit into this organizational pattern. Do you feel left out? Do you feel, and I make a big deal, like, do you feel any different than you did 5 minutes ago? And they're always like, no, I'm the same piece of data. So here's another tip to take away. When we're organizing, the data doesn't change. The structure we're putting on top of the data changes. So you may have a really great piece of data, but it may not fit in very well based on what you're trying to talk about or how you're trying to organize. And then you have a choice. You can either leave that piece of data out, or you can kind of rearrange what you're doing that it'll fit better. Um, that is the best way, I think, to start getting main points, is once you've gathered all of your information, see information gathering video, um, then you can start to make choices about where things go and how they might fit together. And the different choices you make will determine, where your information ends up and how it connects or links through. So how do I make these choices? Well, there's some things to keep in mind. The first main thing to keep in mind is your information itself. You can't organize something you don't have. You certainly could go look for more information if you're like, shoot, I need more on this and I don't have it. But like, you want to be using the information you have. That's what helps guide your structure, right? So the information's the big one. The other big thing is the audience. If I'm giving a speech on slam poetry and I'm giving it to a class like you, usually I ask people how many people know anything about slam poetry. And usually I get maybe one person who raises their hand, but most people don't know much about it. So if I was organizing a speech on slam poetry for you all, I would need to include a bit of history, right? Specifically how it started. It started in Chicago at a restaurant when someone stood up on a table. Like, I would have to tell that story. But if I was at a poets convention and my audience was all poets, more of them might know the history of slam poetry, so I might not need to include that. I might need to spend less time on that. Does it make sense how the audience helps guide like what it is you're doing? Huh? And then the third thing is you're the one making structural choices. So you want to think about, like, how do these pieces of information make sense? How do they go together? How is it going to be easier for the audience to hear them? A lot of times people forget the differences between reading and speaking. So when I'm reading a book, if I miss something and I'm like, wait, what's happening? I can always just flip back. Flip, 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 flip. But in a speech, I can't. So you as the speaker have to make choices for me, the audience, to help me hear the information. How are you getting the information from your paper into your brain, out your mouth, to me, so that I best understand it? Through structure. Through structure and organization. Yay! So, how many of you, when an outline is required, you just write the paper or the speech, and then you're like, shit, I have to do an outline. And then you do the outline afterwards, and then you hand that in. I know you. I see you. We're not gonna do that, okay? An outline, which is usually people like think an outline is a dirty word. They're like, I hate outlining. And I'm like that. So I don't want it, like, I was like that for years. Well, what I didn't know, or I didn't realize, I was outlining in my head. You're outlining in your head. You're just not doing as well as you could do it if you did it on paper. So don't just start writing. Write your ideas down and then move them around and organize them into like a bare bones structure. That's an outline. Now, what type of speeches are we giving next week? Anyone? Extemporaneous speeches. So what that means is all of our speeches for this class are extemporaneous, the main ones. You can do whatever you want for the mini speech, but the main ones are all extemporaneous. Why is this, Mizzo? Couple of reasons. There's a bunch of different ways to give speeches, and the one that people usually tend towards is manuscript speaking, meaning they write every word out and then they read it. That is usually not the most effective way to give a speech, and here's why. 1, reading makes you go really, really, really fast. 2, speeches are hard to write. The goal of speaking isn't the writing, it's the talking. So it's easier for people to talk speeches than it is for them to write them. When they start writing, they become papers, not speeches, meaning your structure doesn't work as well for a listening audience, works better for a reading audience. And remember, you're reading really fast, so it's hard to grab the information. So an outline is what you're going to be speaking from. You're not going to write word for this speech. Now, some of you are freaking out right now. It's going to be okay. Can you write every word and give the speech? Yeah, you could. I believe you could already do that. I'm trying to teach you this skill where you can gather your information, craft it into an organization, practice talking that, right? It's not like you put it in the organization or the structure and then you wing it. No, you practice it that way. And then you are able to use those notes, those limited notes. That's what extemporaneous speaking is, speaking from limited notes. You're able to use those notes to give the speech. So that's what we're going to do. So as you can see, structure and organization is going to be really important because you're like, where am I putting these pieces? How do they fit? And then when you get it enough to where you can start practicing it out loud, because you're going to want to practice it at least 5 to 10 times out loud, at least before you record it. So when you're practicing, you can then make notes and change things around, right? In the same way, if you're writing, you're like reading it in your head and rewriting. This is similar, it's just a different process. We're not writing out every word. You're not taking time to do that. You're practicing the speaking part. So getting things in an organization and then practice speaking it out loud. That's similar to writing, but it's not writing, it's speaking. And it's a public speaking class, so that's what we're going to do. So you can see why a structure and organization is going to be very important. I've put up some guides about outlines and some templates. You can move them around, use them different ways, right? As far as how you might do that, but structure is gonna be really important because that's the vehicle where you help your audience hear all that beautiful information you gathered in a way that makes sense to them and helps them process the information.